putting my timer on so I can actually see the time. So I'm going to start differently than I normally start. I'm going to reflect a little bit about the notion of activists linking to identity. Because even though much of my academic work is rooted in the Indigenous coast of northwest British Columbia, where I'm from, my activism has been class-based. I've been involved in a range of different extra-parliamentary left activities. I had the pleasure of, with my classmates, when I was doing my doctoral work, taking over our campus. It was an easy thing to do. It was an accident, actually, but that's a whole different story. But I want to begin what I say with that account, and then I might, I think, end with the way that I normally would talk, and say about the reason why I started in this way. So I want to tell you 3 stories. And these are stories that I've strung together chronologically. They come out of my own personal experience. But they're also stories that I have, since I'm an academic, written about. Early in the 1980s, up in Prince Rupert, in the commercial fishing industry, many of the non-Aboriginal fishermen were fighting very strongly and strenuously against Aboriginal rights and title. As far as the fishermen were concerned, it was a question of cash, not fish, and it should be dealt with as such. One day, now I have to tell you, I fished in my father's boat, commercial salmon seine. One day, the fleet of the Fishermen's Co-op, which was an independent but predominantly non-Aboriginal operation in terms of the boats, but predominantly Aboriginal in terms of the shore workers. One day, the fishermen's fleet there, along with a number of others, including members from the big boat fleet attached to the major union in the coast, blockaded the Prince Rupert Ferry, or the BC Ferry. And they did so in protest against the Oka crisis that was happening in Ontario. And the protest was, not only was it against the Oka crisis, but it was against the whole, as was said, idiocy of rights and title. Now, later that very same day, there was a march in support of the Oka community, organized by Bob Hill and members of the Citizen Tribal Council at the time, and they walked through town. As then a young man, I was in both locations, talking to people, taking pictures, recording. Because in addition to being a commercial fisherman on my father's fish boat, I was also a master's student at York University in Toronto. But later that day, after everything was over and I was walking back to the boat to do some work, to get ready, I met one of the men who I'd known since I was a little boy around my dad's boat, and he came up to me and he said, "Oh, Charlie," he says, "I saw you today." "I saw you." Not sure what he meant. He said, "Yeah, I saw you." He said, "You know what? You got to make a choice." And he had his hands up like this. You're one side or the other. Now, a few years later, I had a group of students with me in Prince Rupert doing field school. A couple of the students were in Kakatla, the village that my father's family comes from, doing some work. Some of the other students were in Prince Rupert. And one of the young women who was doing approaching and fishing came up to me at the end of one day, and she was in some degree of distress and worry and upset. And she said, "You know, I had a problem today." "Oh dear." I said, "Oh, it wasn't a really bad one." She said, "No. And she said, "Well, I don't know if it really is a problem at all, but it was really a bit troubling." And I said, "Well, what happened?" She said, "Well, I took that list of names that you gave me of men who might want to talk about the changes in the fishing industry, and just about every one of them refused to talk to me." I said, "Well, that happens sometimes. That's the price of research. You never know if people will talk to you or not." She says, no, it wasn't that. It wasn't that at all. This is a young woman who came from up in Alaska and grew up in a rural community. Worked as a cocktail waitress in a bar to make money in the summer. Family was involved in fishing. And so she wasn't quite, that, she told me, no, it wasn't that at all. I said, well, what was it? She said, well, it wasn't until the last guy who told me to meet me at the Breakers. Breakers is a pub in Prince Rupert that used to be a ship chandlery, a marine supply store that my grandfather worked in. I have memories of it when it was that way as a kid. Anyway, she said she met this guy down there, and he said, so you're working with Charlie Menzies, eh? Oh, yes, she says. He suggested I talk to you. Oh, he says, well, he's too much into that Indian crap these days. He said, I'm not going to talk to you, and no one will, about this issue. A little while later, when I said a little while, I'm talking actually a few months, years, I was a draft of a paper that I was thinking of publishing, since that's what we do as academics. And I shared it with a cousin. And this paper talked a little bit about some of these stories, among other things, some other ones. And my cousin sat in our house in the kitchen in Prince Rupert, and she looked at the paper, and she said she'd come back. She says, this paper makes me cry. She said, this is a terrible story. She said, I know these people. I grew up with them. My husband works with them. My kids go to school with their kids. This is a terrible story. These are terrible stories. It makes me feel heartsick. And she says, but we have to say it. We can't be quiet. So, I have for a long period of time been involved in all kinds of what I call social justice activities, what I call political activities that I would argue to you are class-based. But despite all my desires and efforts to maintain and to operate within that domain, these events in truth that come from my own life that leave me no opportunity but to say that there are other things that while I might challenge or deny the necessity for a politics-based identity, the reality is that until we challenge these identities, the politics, the social situations that require them will keep us locked in these rather retrograde locations. So much of what I do in terms of putting this politics into place comes in what I call revealing the semi-private stories that are told. These, perhaps in the male vernacular, the locker room stories that are spoken of, that are whispered, that everyone understands. It's the truth behind the stories that allow a Bill Vander Zalm or a Mike Scott or a John Cummins to say the things they do. They're the understory of racism, of discrimination, of colonialism. They're also the same kinds of stories that allow a student in the back of my First Nations BC course to ask me, well, what's the big deal anyway? It looks like everything is so nice and Indians get so much. What's the big deal? So, I think there is a big deal. And what we need to do is actually put these stories into print. That we need to be able to hear them in all the banality and ugliness. And by revealing and exposing them, we actually can challenge the racism inherent within it. I'll say one final comment, and it's another story. I was one time given the opportunity by Simon Fraser University to teach a course up in Kitimat. A course for people doing a business degree, in which the one course, the one elective that they decided would be appropriate for them was a course on First Nations issues. And it was quite illuminating to me, and I think it's changed my approach to teaching quite significantly. Because I made an effort to ensure that every piece of writing was in a sense, in defense of, missing the word, that each piece of writing, each work that was presented to them was at the highest so-called academic standard of excellence. They wasn't necessarily jargon-laden, but it would be a piece that everybody would at least agree was well-written, clearly based in theory and in data, and in that sense unassailable. I think it was all summed up for me when one gentleman who also had told me he'd never ever been to the village of Kitimat and wasn't quite sure if those were Haisla or Kitimat people or what the difference was, who said to me, he says, you know, I don't really care. He says, you might in fact be right. This stuff might in fact be well done. I don't care. I don't agree. There's no such thing as rights and title. This is the way the world works. And I say it changed the way in which I consider teaching, because I think that the only way that one can teach effectively is to teach in an anti-racist pedagogy in a way that will ultimately offend and disrupt people in front of us. And that's a problematic thing in the University of Excellence that demands teaching to meet client satisfaction levels, in which our objective is to provide a service as a commodity that's being purchased so that we can then be evaluated on a set of indices that measure that, basically, the middle-of-the-road teaching. It's not to say we can't do exciting teaching that challenges people, but what will end up happening is that there will be a self-selection, of course, ends up in terms of classes. So the people who are here today, the people who were at the research workshop on Saturday last week, the people who choose because they already are on board. So I do try to do that. It's not in a comfortable position to be in the class, but I think it's one that I actually have the privilege and the luxury to be able to exercise at this moment in my life. And as my cousin said to me, that these are ugly stories. They need to be told. We can't allow them to sit in the back rooms, in the cloakrooms, in the locker rooms, and hidden out of sight. That it's time for us to make them public. And with that, I wish to acknowledge where we stand in Musqueam territory, to acknowledge my uncles and my aunts for this teaching and the training and the instruction they have given me, and to recognize that who I am, in fact, makes what I do have meaning for me, and hopefully has purpose for the people that I interact with on a daily